I think for a country like South Africa, there is a sense that the situation in Palestine is fundamentally important within South African foreign policy because it has a historical legacy within South Africa's foreign policy, democratic change, and this idea of the anti-apartheid movements and Palestinian solidarity movements kind of walking hand in hand over the decades.
Chinesische, russische und iranische Kriegsschiffe trainieren bei einer Marineübung vor Kapstadt. Doch Südafrikas Außenpolitik im Nahen Osten ist älter als diese Schlagzeilen. Und dort schaut man genau hin. Was bedeutet Südafrikas historische Solidarität mit Palästina heute? Für Iran, für die Golfstaaten und für die globale Ordnung? Mit Gustavo de Carvalho vom South African Institute of International Affairs spreche ich hier in Kapstadt über BRICS, über Sanktionen, über Gaza und darüber, ob Blockfreiheit heute strategische Autonomie bedeutet oder gefährliche Ambiguität. Willkommen zu Fokus Nahost. Mein Name ist Josephine Herrmann. Heute bin ich in Kapstadt, Südafrika. Hier am südlichen Ende des afrikanischen Kontinents treffen geopolitische Linien aufeinander. BRICS, die Golfstaaten, China, Russland, Iran und ein Land, das seine Außenpolitik als blockfrei bezeichnet, Südafrika. Doch was bedeutet Blockfreiheit in einer Welt, in der Kriege zunehmen, Sanktionen verschärft werden und neue Machtblöcke entstehen? Mein heutiger Gast ist Gustavo de Carvalho. Er ist Senior Researcher im African Governance and Diplomacy Program des South African Institute of International Affairs, einem der führenden außenpolitischen Thinktanks des Landes. Er beschäftigt sich mit Afrikas Rolle zwischen den Machtblöcken und mit BRICS. Der Staatenverbund, ursprünglich bestehend aus Brasilien, Russland, Indien, China und Südafrika, versteht sich als Plattform des globalen Südens. 2024 trat Iran bei. In dieser Podcast-Folge sprechen wir darüber, was Irans BRICS-Mitgliedschaft wirklich verändert, warum die Marineübung vor Kapstadt mit China, Russland und Iran international so brisant waren, welche Rolle Südafrika im Gaza-Konflikt einnehmen will und ob Blockfreiheit heute strategische Autonomie bedeutet. Gustavo, South Africa describes its foreign policy as non-aligned. Yet within BRICS, Iran has been a member since 2024, and the Gulf states are watching this very closely. How do South Africa's foreign policy choices within BRICS intersect with developments in the Middle East?
And I think one important thing to think about when we're looking into South Africa and especially its non-aligned policy is to explain what non-alignment perhaps is not and what it is. Because for South Africa, the idea of non-alignment, it is not an idea of neutrality. That is very much a Switzerland legal type of position. And when we look into this kind of more modern take of what non-alignment is for countries like South Africa, strategic alignment for other countries, multi-alignment for others, fundamentally what it does, it is to look for a space for seeking autonomy within an international space that is very fragmented. That means for countries like South Africa that decisions are very much taken from the positionality of the country, where are we standing, how we see the world, but also with difficult calculations on which countries are important, which countries are not, what kind of decisions are we willing to take that doesn't make us fully part of one camp or another. That means that especially in areas like the Middle East for South Africa, you see clearly a space in which there is one fundamental aspect for the South African foreign policy approaches within the region that has to do with Palestine, and it has all to do with the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. Because despite the fact that South Africa was not part of the non-alignment movement, of course, during the apartheid regime, South Africa was very much aligned with the Western Bloc. But the ANC was, the African National Congress, was very active within the processes, so was the Palestinian Solidarity Movement. So that famous, almost cliché sentence from Mandela that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of Palestinian people, it's very much in line with how some of those developments within the region, and also explains why since democratization in South Africa in the 1990s, South Africa remained very active with providing support and providing a voice that can really engage with those issues. So I think in a large degree, the non-aligned policy of South Africa, and just to conclude this question, I think it does really help us to understand how South Africa engages with the region, including with countries like Iran and others, and how does it find spaces of maneuver, which is perhaps the most difficult aspect within this fragmented global space.
But is there a point when non-alignment risks being perceived as complicity?
Absolutely. I think that South Africa, when presenting its non-aligned policy, really struggled over the years, and particularly after the invasion of Ukraine, especially because as a concept, it was a very present concept within speeches and declarations within South Africa since the 1990s, when South Africa joins the non-aligned movement. But to a large degree, it really forced the country to rethink, what does it really mean? South Africa never really had to spend much time really unpacking this idea after the 1990s, because it often was presented almost as a legacy concept from previous eras. And at the moment, I think what does but also it triggers one aspect that is very common within South African foreign policy, that it's often very reactive rather than proactive. So there is issues happen, South Africa responds often in a vague or a little bit late. And increasingly, South Africa has realized that in many of those issues, whether it was the situation in Ukraine, where especially since mid-2023, South Africa started being much more clear in terms of its focus on dialogue and mediation, the participation in the Ukraine peace formula process that led to the summit in Switzerland. All of those aspects, to a certain degree, really shows that the style of foreign policy that South Africa has developed over the last decade and a half in particular, that is to be a little bit more reactive, a little bit more reluctant of being proactive on issues which are slightly more controversial. Many of the crises of bilateral relations with other countries that we've had to do primarily with that. So the country is still trying to find its way to not be seen as necessarily complicit, but also to a certain degree, how does it ground itself into some of its core ideas of what our interests are in particular situations, and making it more clear to the domestic population, but also to its own bilateral partners. And that is essential for me.
When Chinese, Russian, and Iranian warships recently conducted naval drills off Cape Town, many observers in the Middle East and the West read this as a political signal. What signal do you think South Africa is actually sending?
I think it's a very good question, and perhaps one that is as difficult to answer, as fragmented often as the domestic space it is in South Africa. Because first, one can argue that this is a fairly regular naval exercise that South Africa has done over the years with BRICS countries. Before, they were called MOSI 1 and MOSI 2, and now in 2026 the name was changed for World for Peace. So to a certain degree, South Africa aim to continue with those. Previously, primarily Russia and China had been part of. This exercise became also very controversial in 2023 for all of the wrong reasons, especially because the exercise was done right on the first anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine, and that really increased the pressure that the country was receiving. So that, to a large degree, shows this in-between position that often is quite hard for South Africa to pursue. On the one hand, it is very hard to tell China and Russia, like, oh, we don't want to do those exercises at all, because at the end of the day, historically, South Africa tended to do a lot of those exercises, including naval exercises, with a variety of countries, whether it's Germany, whether it was the United States in previous administrations, and it wanted to continue with this diversification of spaces. The challenge here is that the message that was coming out of the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, our foreign ministry, and the message that was presented and continued by the Department of Defense were often at odds with one another, with a lot of controversies on whether the Department of Defense simply ignored the orders from President Ramaphosa that requested that Iran would not participate, primarily due to fears of potential sanctions, and Iranian participation then continued, showing that these multiple views of the world is not often fully representative of one South Africa, and often what different sectors of South African society then perceive. Some could argue that this still remains a China-led military exercise that happens to be in South African waters. Probably not a very strong argument, but it's one that we often hear about. But at the same time, it does really create, I think, an important inflection point. Not that South Africa should necessarily completely abandon its relations with other BRICS members like Iran. But at the same time, I think there is a framing of narrative and there is a shaping of actions that needs to be a little bit more intentional and the messages to be a little bit more clear. Because otherwise, this space of a strategic ambiguity that South Africa often places itself within that position becomes much harder to pursue.
But what happens when countries that call themselves non-aligned engage in military cooperations with states whose governments or key institutions are under international sanctions?
Yes, I think in that regard, I think it goes back to what non-alignment then is. It's not one that's country like South Africa would necessarily be pursuing a space of equidistance. It's not really this idea that we are in between all of those powers and we're right in the middle. It is a space where the type of friction and the type of inconsistencies are to be expected. Of course, I think in the South African case, there is the fundamental questions of what type of sanctions are those, if we're talking about bilateral sanctions or sanctions that are endorsed by the United Nations and by the United Nations Security Council in particular. South Africa has over the years really shaped its positions around sanctions to be one that we will always follow through international sanctions regimes that are endorsed by the United Nations and treads much more carefully when it comes to bilateral sanctions that are presented by whether it's the European Union, whether it's the United States. That in a way, I think it is part because the relationship in that case with Iran becomes an important one fundamentally because it's not that important in the sense of South Africa is not trading a lot with Iran. When President Trump shares that we are going to sanction countries that are trading with Iran, there was probably some sense of relief in Pretoria because, well, okay, we don't trade that much with them, it's quite small. We don't tend to coordinate a lot of foreign policy issues with them, and neither even within the context of BRICS. BRICS is not really a space for full coordination of foreign policy. In that sense, I think what South Africa is trying to find, and it's not always very successful, is how far can we go within a space that we want to find margin of maneuver of interaction? So in principle, South Africa would be quite reluctant of simply denouncing bilateral relations based on sanctions that are provided elsewhere, or particularly by strained relations that third-party countries have amongst themselves. Which of course is not a particularly easy process to do. And South Africa seems to always be in a space of catching up and trying to do damage control after the fact, in part because I think it could be a bit more intentional, organized and proactive. But I think in part that is a structural position that the country sees itself, that none of these major power blocks even though they're quite big and much larger than South Africa, but none of them seem to be that big that will justify us really moving away from one side versus the other. And I think it has to do, in that sense, with domestic issues, but also on South Africa's own perception about power dynamics globally that makes some of these incentives a bit harder for the country to pursue.
You mentioned Iran. What does Iran's BRICS membership change in practice? And is Iran gaining diplomatic cover through BRICS? Or is it maybe intentionally or as a byproduct?
I think to a certain extent, I think when the expansion was discussed in 2023 here in South Africa in the Johannesburg BRICS summit, it was one that looked for expanding not just for the sake of expansion, but one expansion that fundamentally aimed to be a little bit more representative, especially within the Global South. Of course, not all BRICS members are part of the Global South, but largely there is a perception of this group that can elevate the voice of its individual members and this kind of meta region like the Global South is. To a large degree, I think if we're looking to what countries join BRICS, we have an interesting mix and match of all sorts of countries, because we think often about Iran, very much a choice that came from Russia at that particular stage. But we have countries like the UAE that can be very controversial in Africa and very present in Africa, being already the largest investor within the continent, very controversial roles, especially in the case of Sudan, in the Horn of Africa, and in North Africa. We have countries like Indonesia that plays perhaps a much more similar role internationally than what countries like South Africa, Brazil, or India do. Ethiopia and Egypt bring in this more African representation, but in the case of Egypt, this dual representation of being both an African country and a Middle Eastern country. So when we think of expansion within that sense, yes, it does provide a platform for the Iranians to show that we're not that isolated as one can perceive, but it certainly does not give it a free pass to make decisions and to choose positions as the country fully wants. First, because BRICS fully operates by consensus, and consensus in that sense is not only a tool to making decisions, but it's seen as a value. Because when we are so dissimilar to one another within a group, we need to find minimum common denominators within that space. And what does it mean is that if we cannot agree, like we couldn't as a group last year within the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, what was then possible at that stage was to find a summary of positions that would somehow find those very dissimilar positions, even about one of the specific members, that could give a sense of this is what we can agree in terms of what our disagreements and discomfort with the situation is, but not fully, we cannot really fully see even that summary of positions being a copy and paste to what Iranian positions are. Perhaps not the full answer to the question, but I think it gives some of the different challenges that exist within the group really to be a tool for any of its members of full representation of what its views of the world is. And that negotiated process to a large degree is what makes BRICS both perhaps a little bit more exciting than it seems, but also far more boring than it seems at the same time, because its ability of making common positions have to be very much based on how do you cater for a very broad membership in that sense.
Gulf states want stability, they want investment, they want predictability. At the same time, they face escalating risks: Iran, Gaza, Red Sea disruptions. Where does South Africa position itself in this balancing act?
I think, especially if we're looking to the role of the Gulf Cooperation Council, and I think countries like UAE, like Qatar, even Saudi Arabia to a large degree, not only how does Africa and South Africa sees that in the region, but also very much within a space where these countries are expanding their international relations to a point of increasing diversification, increasing markets, and increasing connections with other spaces. So if we look, for instance, the role of the UAE and the massive investments that we see in several different sectors, whether we're thinking about the logistics sector with the really huge world of DP World, all of our Africa investments in the mining sector, and especially in areas related to energy transition, but also even in terms of changes in terms of technology and semiconductors and the different minerals and metals that are required for that. We're recording this in Cape Town during the period where there is the Mining Indaba, the largest mining conference within the African continent. And we see a massive presence of Gulf countries within the region really looking into that diversification. To a certain degree, I think what it does provide for Gulf countries, but I think what it can provide to countries like South Africa is really a space where new players are starting to interact much deeper with one another, while historically a lot of those relations still remain within a certain number of traditional countries, whether they were in Europe or even with China for the past 20 years. And this pursuit of new sectors, new markets, that increases not only the new number of players that come here and to really sustain traditional types of interactions, but one that is becoming increasingly stronger for African countries, that it has to do with the need to increase added value of that relationship, and particularly the products that we're dealing with one another, whether it's in terms of beneficiation of metals, whether it's in terms of investments that are not just extractive in nature, but really that provides a stronger positioning for them. And because there is so many players out there, it does provide an opportunity for Gulf countries, but they are not alone within that space, meaning that they need to provide terms that are more favorable to the countries that they're engaging with. Otherwise, there are choices that some of those can be replaced.
Gustavo, can you think of a constructive South African role when it comes to Gaza? Can BRICS play in any constructive role when it comes to Gaza? Or is it primarily functioning as a counter-Western platform in this context? And what does South Africa realistically want to achieve there?
I think if we start with BRICS and how it plays a role in many of those geopolitical disputes internationally, it's one of those areas where it is particularly hard to find common positions and a coordinated action around that. So in 2023, when South Africa was chairing BRICS, South Africa calls a meeting, an extraordinary meeting of BRICS countries on the situation in Gaza. And what was clear, similar to what we saw with the 12-day war between Israel and Iran last year, was one of the inability of really finding a common ground that would enable the group really to do a more proactive kind of response. And at the end, it was a fairly vague statement of the chair, meaning that we could not really fully reach an agreement between its members. And one should expect that to continue to a certain degree. BRICS countries have been, BRICS as a group has been particularly shy when it comes to place itself as a major player when it comes to many of those issues, either because some of our members are part of some of those disputes, or either simply because we cannot find agreement. What it does leave for the group, I think, is really that focus and pursuit of the areas in which the group can agree, whether it is in terms of issues related to the members' positions and the role within international financial institutions like the World Bank or the IMF, or whether the discussions around settling trade with local currencies, which will still take a long time, and even in some of internally controversial issues, but there is the possibility of debate and engagement like Security Council reform. I think for a country like South Africa, there is a sense that the situation in Palestine is fundamentally important within South African foreign policy because it has a historical legacy within South Africa's foreign policy, democratic change, and this idea of the anti-apartheid movement and the Palestinian solidarity movement kind of walking hand in hand over the decades. For South Africa, I think was an interesting take when it comes to how it saw itself post-October 2023. Perhaps we would have been surprised here in South Africa. South Africa had done nothing because it is a very present issue within South African foreign policy. The interesting thing there was the choice of South Africa to go to the International Court of Justice versus movements of disinvestment and sanctions versus much more combative. And it is fairly combative because the bilateral relations with Israel are not in a good shape in any way at the moment. But it was really the message that South Africa wanted to see, that the International Court of Justice is the highest organ within international law for those kinds of disputes. What South Africa was presenting is that we think there is a genocide going on. What the court so far has done is that it's a plausible case. It's not, there's been no final decisions or findings that have been issued by that, but really was to show like that this idea of an international rules order needs to be applied also in situations like that. And for South Africa does become an important tool, a dual tool, one to signal its own support to the Palestinians and what they are going through in terms of international solidarity, but at the same time to showcase there is still, even if there are disagreements, the International Court of Justice in principle would have been and would be the right space for those discussions, whether the court would say that at the end of the case, whether the South African claims are correct or not. That, I think, despite a lot of controversy that it creates, especially with countries that are more supportive towards the position of Israel, but to a large degree, I think it goes much closer to what countries in Europe, for instance, look when we're thinking about the role of international rules-based order, because that in principle would be the environment for that. And I think it does signal this interest of South Africa to, at times, to kind of rock the boat, but not really to jump ship entirely.
Gustavo, from your perspective, what is the biggest misunderstanding about South Africa's role in the Middle East today?
I think perhaps a few. I think there is a few misunderstandings. I think if we start with Iran, I think one of them is this idea that South Africa often plays this strategically ambiguous place and position in the world, which does not necessarily mean a full support. It didn't mean that South Africa was fully supporting Russia after the invasion of Ukraine, and neither fully means that South Africa is fully supporting everything that is happening in Iran, and particularly the role of Iran in the region. So I would say this is one, and I think it's more confusing and fragmented because of the very domestic space that South Africa plays and the multiple views and positions that exist. I think the second one, it has to do with the fact that South Africa is this idea of being a non-aligned country, that it means that South Africa is looking once again for neutrality or equidistance of spaces. I think in this particular moment where countries often are forced or interested in taking international positions that are a little bit more case by case, that looks for diversification of relations, that look for a space and a path for autonomy, not of equidistance, but one that gives more margin of maneuver. That, I think, is very much the conundrum that South Africa often has. And to a large degree, I think what South Africa perhaps needs to understand more, and I think, is how do we utilize the tools that we have at the moment to not only be more visible when it comes to some of those issues, but particularly one that makes us more influential in some of them. That doesn't mean that South Africa needs to fully take one side over the other, but it does require a little bit more of strategic clarity, of intentionality of actions, particularly one that presents itself as what is the added value that South Africa can bring at the moment. Otherwise, South Africa would remain within a position of marginality within that particular sphere, when it's clearly a region where it features very heavily and very importantly within the South African thinking of foreign policy and its own role in the world.
Gustavo, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for this invitation.
Das war eine neue Folge von Fokus Nahost mit Gustavo de Carvalho, Senior Researcher im South African Institute of International Affairs. Wenn euch diese Folge gefallen hat, teilt sie gerne, abonniert den Podcast und lasst eine Bewertung da. So könnt ihr helfen, dass noch mehr Menschen diese Perspektiven hören. Wenn ihr mögt, könnt ihr dieses Interview auch in meinem Substack-Newsletter nachlesen. Und dann hören wir uns bald wieder. Danke fürs Zuhören und bis bald.